Snack. Oh.
Turns out that Lin-Manuel Miranda is not showing up.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Probably too busy.
Probably too busy, yeah. So we're going to have to just dive into the history of the actual transcendentalist movement. Maybe he'll come next week.
Okay, maybe.
Okay.
So, can you tell me about the history of transcendentalism? When was it formed?
So there's actually one event that you could look at as kind of when the transcendentalist movement started. It was in September of 1836. Harvard was celebrating its bicentennial, and a whole bunch of people came to celebrate. And at that time, there were four alumni of Harvard by the name of Frederick Hedge, Ralph Waldo Emerson, George Ripley, and George Putnam. And they had agreed to form a discussion group. So Hedge had left Boston. He became a pastor in Bangor, Maine. And they kind of agreed that whenever Hedge came down to Boston from Bangor, they would get together a group of people and just talk about issues. So they met again later in September, a couple of weeks later after the bicentennial. And it was a little bit of a larger group, but it was really formed by that core of four individuals meeting, who then formed a larger group of roughly 30 people. And it was just based on that small group that would meet whenever Hedge came in to Boston from Bangor. So even though transcendentalism came out of kind of a larger dissatisfaction with Unitarianism, the identity of the people and when they started to get together and talk is pretty easy to spot. It's a real, very kind of well-defined moment in time.
Oh, cool. So who were some of their leaders?
So George Ripley was really one of the leading members of the group. He was one of the leading writers of the day, and his work focused on the theological questions of the day, specifically miracles. Because even though the Unitarians rejected the divinity of Jesus and rejected Trinitarianism, they still believed in the literal truth of the New Testament. They believed that Jesus had actually performed all the miracles that had been ascribed to him in the New Testament. And Ripley was one of the first writers in America to just sort of challenge the belief in miracles and really the idea that miracles can prove the truth of Christianity. Because, as he put it, the belief in the miracles is based on a belief in Christianity. You can't take that argument and flip it on its head and say that you can prove the proof of Christianity through miracles, because you only believe in miracles because you believe in Christianity. So he had this argument. He wrote a book called The Discourse of Philosophy of Religion in 1836. And that question about evidence, the evidence for religion and the truth of miracles, that was really kind of the break between transcendentalists and the Unitarians that they came from.
Okay.
Another major leader was Orestes Brownson. And we're going to actually be spending a lot of time on him, and he's interesting because for a couple of reasons. First of all, he was really one of the leading intellectuals of the group. He was really the best philosopher of the group. He had the best grasp of philosophical issues. But he also focused a lot on political and socioeconomic questions. So even though that's not really the public common perception of what transcendentalism is all about, Brownson that was his focus. He started a journal. He originally called it the Boston Quarterly Review, but he was the editor of it and tried to gather a lot of written material from other people. He ended up doing almost all of the writing himself, and he later renamed it Brownson's Quarterly Review, which made sense because it was basically his own thoughts. But at the beginning of the movement, even though they're not the most famous people today, Ripley and Brownson were really the most prominent.
Okay.
Another one was Bronson Alcott. And he's probably not quite as famous as his daughter, Louisa May Alcott. She wrote
Little Women.
Little Women. And Little Women is actually, it's a story about her growing up, about her family. So the family that's portrayed in Little Women is actually Bronson Alcott's family. And again, he had a totally different interest from the rest of the group. His interest was focused on education and education reform.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he had so education of small children at the time was very much focused on rote learning. That people should, students. There was a fixed curriculum, and students were expected to memorize that. And he had this idea that education should be about teaching students how to think
Mm.
rather than content based. Um, he opened up a school in 1834 in Boston. It was opened in the building of the Masonic Temple, so it became known as the Temple School. Um, so they used, even though they had little kids, it was basically an elementary school. They used the Socratic method, where they had questions, they had discussion. It was very discussion oriented.
They sit in a circle?
They sat in a circle, but they faced outward,
Hmm.
so
Interesting.
that each student could write in his journal and do his work without having to look at other people. But when they had group projects, they would draw children from the circle and bring them into the middle of the room,
Hmm.
so that each student had a combination of group work and activity where he was kind of not looking at anybody else. Um,
Interesting.
yeah. So that was really his one of his innovations. He was really associated with educational reform. He had an assistant by the name Elizabeth Peabody, and Peabody, her and her sisters also form a very interesting element within this group. So first of all, um, as we'll see, the Transcendentalists, there was a lot of room for feminist thought within early Transcendentalism. Um, but Elizabeth is interesting because she opened up a bookstore. Her her family lived in Boston on West Street, um, and she took the family house and turned it into a bookstore. Um, she was the assistant to Bronson Alcott. She had two sisters, Mary and Sophia. Her sister, Mary, was also interested in educational reform, and she ended up marrying Horace Mann, who was one of the major transitional figures in American education,
Hmm.
not just a school in Riverdale.
Yeah.
And her youngest sister, Sophia, was an artist, and she eventually married Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Okay.
So each one of the sisters really had an important role to play together with their husband in the development of American culture in the first half of the 19th century. So what Elizabeth did was she took her family home in Boston and turned it into a bookstore, but it also became sort of like a salon cafe kind of place where people would come. She carried um, foreign periodicals, so you could come, have some coffee,
Hmm.
read
Sounds
read
nice.
read materials that wouldn't always be available. And a lot of people would say that that was like one of the things that they would do when they would come to Boston, would go to visit her bookstore, and it became kind of like a hangout place for a lot of the transcendentalists. She also became a publisher,
Hmm.
and she actually was Hawthorne's publisher. She published some of the books of her brother-in-law. So some of the most, um, you know, well-known stories or book collections in American history were published by Peabody.
Hmm. Do you have any others?
Yeah, as a matter of
I feel like
fact, I
there's
do.
one more.
There's one more. So another woman who played a very important role in this is a woman by the name of Margaret Fuller.
Hmm.
She had also worked as an assistant to Bronson Alcott in the Temple School. But by 1840, a couple of years after the group had um, started meeting, they wanted to form a journal.
Mm-hmm.
Bronson's quarterly review was a little bit too much focused just on Bronson. So they wanted to have another outlet where people could write essays or stories, and have a voice to publicize their views. And they decided that Margaret Fuller um, would be the person to be the editor. She was also an essayist of her own. She wrote one of the first essays in American cultural history asserting um, equal rights for women. So she plays an important part. Um, and so she was the head of this journal, which was known as the Dial. Really also played an important part in transcendentalist history. It existed for 4 years, 1840 to 1844, under Fuller's authorship. Um, After that, in 1844, um, she moved to New York. The Dial didn't really have enough subscribers to be commercially successful, so she went to work for the New York Tribune. Um, and her first job, she was a literary editor there, and her first job was to write a book review of Emerson's book of essays. So you see, like all of these people kind of knew each other, hung out together in the Peabody Bookshop, wrote reviews of each other's work. You can kind of see how it's kind of a close knit circle of,
Sort of grassroots.
yeah, kind of a circle of people. She had actually been a friend of Emerson, and she was romantically interested in him, even though the feeling was not mutual. She thought
Ooh.
he was, yeah. So she found Emerson to be very kind of self centered and cold. And I think that when we go looking, like when we read Emerson, especially like essays like Self Reliance, we can see that he doesn't,
A little aloof.
yeah, he doesn't seem to be that emotionally sensitive. Um, so when she moved to New York, she really became very active in a whole bunch of social reform movements in a very interesting way. Um, she developed a close relationship with the chaplain at Sing Sing prison, the woman who was responsible for women inmates. And she became an advocate for prison reform, for women's rights, um, the relief for the indigent. She made a major expose of the insane asylums of New York
Mm.
to talk about the treatment for people who are unable to take care of themselves. Um, so she was really an early proponent of a lot of different social movements in New York City in the 1840s.
Hmm.
One of the things that was interesting was in the mid 1840s, there was a lot of nationalist movements in Europe. There were movements towards unification of Germany, unification of Italy, Polish nationalism, and this idea of European nationalist movements became very garnered a lot of attention, and the New York Tribune actually sent her to Europe, excuse me,
Hmm.
to become like basically be a reporter there. So she moved to Italy. She started to become involved with some of the people who were involved in the cause of Italian nationalism and the formation of a modern Italian state. She fell in love with a young Italian man. Um, and they eventually got married. They had to leave. They met in Rome. They had to leave Rome. They moved to Florence,
Hmm.
um, and then because of all the violence that was taking place in Italy, they decided to come back to New York, and um, their steamship their steamship sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, and as it was just sort of coming into New York, just on the south shore of Long Island, the crew made a mistake in calculating their location, and they crashed into the sandbars of Fire Island and sank.
Oh.
So Fuller died. She died in 18. So yeah, so she died in 1850. She was very young. So it's really it's a tragic story of somebody who died young.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So what were some of the major events of transcendentalism?
So one of the major events that really garnered a lot of attention was something called the Brook Farm experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And it really relates to what we were talking about before in terms of transcendentalism and social theory.
Uh-huh.
There was actually two settlements that were formed. One was called Fruitlands, the other was Brook Farm, but Brook Farm was the more significant of the two. Um, it was started by George Ripley. As we said before, Ripley was one of the four founding members of the Transcendentalist group and kind of that first creative force. Um, And he decided to form a community that would be populated by transcendentalists.
Oh.
He bought he was able to raise enough money to buy a farm in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, in 1841, and they tried to form a community that would be based on transcendentalist principles. Financially, it didn't work out that well. They advertised it a lot in the Dial. They publicized it with lectures at Elizabeth Peabody's bookstore, but they had trouble attracting enough financial support to make it go. And one of the things that happened then was that in 1846, 5 years into it, they had a major fire, and most of the buildings that they had built burnt down, and they were never really able to recover from that. But Brook Farm is now a National Historic Site. It's operated by the state of Massachusetts. So if anybody is in the Boston area and they want to go, I think Walden is probably the more famous site associated with transcendentalism, but Brook Farm is another one. So yeah. So there's two other major thinkers that we're going to obviously spend a lot of time on. So, so the first is Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he's really kind of the key center of this whole transcendentalist movement. You know, as we saw when the transcendentalist movement started out, he was one of four, and not really the most highly regarded of the four. Brownson, Ripley were really viewed as the leaders of the group. But in 1838, when he published Nature, that was his first published work, and he started to gain some notoriety, not a huge amount.
Are you guys going to read Nature?
We are going to read Nature, but we're also going to read the other work that really pushed him into the public view, which was the Divinity School Address. And that the publication of the Divinity School Address and the debate that surrounded it really kind of pushed Emerson into the center of it. He became a lecturer after that, and his lectures in Boston were really, really popular, and he ended up making a full-time career just giving lectures. He's then started nationwide tours where he would go to other cities and develop lecturers. So by the end of the 1850s, he had become not only the center of the transcendentalist movement, but he was really one of the most well-known and highly regarded thinkers in America at that time. And that's, obviously we'll read a lot more about Emerson, but that's kind of the trajectory of his career and how it fits into the rest of the transcendentalists.
Okay.
And then the other specific individual who's famous is Henry David Thoreau. He was a younger contemporary of Emerson. He started out, he looked to Emerson as his mentor. And when Emerson's career as an essayist and lecturer started to grow, Thoreau really kind of tried to model himself on Emerson's career, the idea that you could actually kind of do this for a living.
Were they both in Boston?
So they did start out in Boston. They both lived in Concord. But in 1843, Thoreau moved to New York. Emerson's brother lived in Staten Island. So Emerson got him a job as a tutor to his brother's kids. He came to New York. He tried to make money as a writer here, but it didn't really work out here in New York. So in 1845, Emerson had bought a plot of land not about a mile away from the center of Concord, in a place along a pond called Walden Pond. And Emerson gave him permission to clear the woods and build a cabin and move in there. And that time at Walden Pond really was what gave him his fame as a writer, and kind of cemented his place in American literary history. One famous event that took place during the time that he was living at Walden Pond was the time of the Mexican War, and the government had imposed a poll tax, which actually sounds like it has to do with voting, but it really doesn't. It's just a per-person tax. Each person had to pay a tax that would finance the war. And Thoreau disagreed with the principles of the Mexican War. He believed that it was basically fought for the purpose of acquiring more territory on which slavery would be able to extend itself. So that basically it was a way for slavery to protect itself. And he didn't want any involvement with that, so he refused to pay his poll tax on the grounds that it went to support a war that he was ideologically opposed to. And he was arrested and put in jail. Um, and he wrote an essay he wrote an essay. It was actually started out as a lecture entitled "Resistance to Civil Government," which he delivered in 1848. It was then published in writing. It became known as Civil Disobedience. The title changed in various versions, so we'll be reading that too. And again, in the course of American political thought, civil disobedience, or Thoreau's essay about civil disobedience, really played a very prominent role in a lot of different ways. Gandhi actually read civil disobedience, and that was formative in Gandhi's coming up with his principles of passive resistance to authority, which then circled back into the United States through Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King's readings of Gandhi. So that Thoreau's influence kind of circled through India and back into the United States as the sort of the classic formulation of how does one deal with a government that is engaged in activities that are unjust. Thoreau died in 1862. He was 44 years old. He died of tuberculosis. So both Fuller and Thoreau are two people two highly regarded transcendentalists who were tragically lived very short lives. So the last little bit that I want to talk about is something called the American Renaissance, which is a concept that was first formulated by a literary critic by the name of F.O. Matheson, who wrote a book called The American Renaissance. And he posits that the 1840s really constitutes this period of an American cultural upheaval. And he focuses on a limited number of writers, Emerson, Thoreau, Melville, Hawthorne, Whitman, as being kind of at the core of this. And each of them, so we've spoken about Thoreau and Emerson, and we'll be reading a little bit of Whitman, but not too much, a little bit. We're not going to be reading any Hawthorne or Melville, but these are all people who lived at the same time and were kind of part of the same circle. Hawthorne is best known for the Scarlet Letter, but as we've seen, he was married to Sophia Peabody, so he was part of the group who was in this. And when you look at Hawthorne's writing, he focuses very heavily on sin and sinfulness and human nature, which are the themes that we talked about as coming out of Calvinism and Unitarianism, and then following into transcendentalism, but also about the role of America and American history. Certainly in the Scarlet Letter, how the town in which it takes place develops is one of the themes of the work. Melville, who lived 1819 to 1891, a little bit of a later contemporary. He was not from New England, he was from New York, but obviously famous for not only his stories, but obviously for Moby Dick. And Moby Dick explores all of those same themes about human nature, human destiny, America, what America is. It's all in the whale. And then finally, the writer that we will cover, Walt Whitman, who overlapped chronologically with Melville, also from New York, originally from Long Island, but most closely associated with Brooklyn. His thinking was more heavily influenced by Quakerism, especially the thought of Elias Hicks. But that has some parallels with kind of the Unitarian transcendentalist themes. He wrote Leaves of Grass, which was really published first in 1855, even though he would later publish later and later editions of the work. But it was really the transformative work of American poetry. When it came out, nobody could really understand it. The only person who had anything good to say about it was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Whitman sent a copy to Emerson, and Emerson really kind of praised it. It wasn't fully discovered as a classic work of American poetry until later, but he was part of the same theme. And then later he wrote a number of poems about the Civil War, the death of Abraham Lincoln. So his concepts became very formative in how America thought about itself as it came out of the American Civil War. And by the time of his death in 1892, Whitman was really largely, by then, regarded as the major poet of American history. So what we can see is that even some of these writers who were kind of tangentially related to transcendentalism, they were formative in the creation of an American literary tradition, American identity, um, America's most famous novelists, America's most famous poet. And these are kind of the different ways that transcendentalism had an impact on American history, American cultural history, and American literature.
Hmm.
So those are some of the things that we'll be covering during the course of the semester.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So how do you think your students can best prepare for the next class?
So just a couple of things to do. First of all, this class has been a little bit more content oriented.
Mm-hmm.
The readings aren't really primary, they're more secondary sources, so it's more information. So I'm really looking for the students to talk about it a little bit, get to know one another, get to know the other member or members of your study group, and just talk about which of these topics that we've talked about, which of them are interesting. The one question I want to know is, we're going to have synchronous class in a couple of days. Which of these things do you think is interesting? What would you like to talk about more?
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
Sounds exciting.
Okay, thanks a lot, Rebecca.